Ask not what the World Economic Forum can do for you, but what you can do for the World Economic Forum.
So looking into Davos 2024, the 54th annual WEF summit meeting and their very telling theme, rebuilding trust. I mean, astounding, right?
We must rebuild trust, and that's actually the theme of our meeting. We have to rebuild trust.
Can you rebuild what just isn't there and never was? I mean, at first glance, it's truly laughable, contemptible, outrageous, creepy how out of touch they seem to be, creepy how arrogant they seem to remain in spite of everything.
When did the word expert become almost an insult?
When the real agenda is just the same old, and there's no reason to, quote, trust it. And so as tempting as that theme is to just throw back in the face of Klaus Schwab, that people don't trust WEF or their agenda, that they reject it, that they're protesting it, it's naive to pretend that that's just all that rebuilding trust is really about, or that it's as simple as the most straightforward of definitions, a firm belief in integrity, ability, character, the condition of having confidence placed in one in which confidence is placed, the opposite of having violated a public trust. These are the first definitions that pull up online, and yeah, there's been a colossal failure there, rebuilding trust. As the Telegraph succinctly said in its headline, the global super rich want to rebuild trust. Good luck with that. There's the AP connecting the WEF's big artistic wall with all these slogans and words centered around rebuilding trust. It was full of buzzwords that they pointed out people said smacked of, quote, empty talk. Critics say the annual meeting are the preserve of business chieftains who covet greater wealth and politicians who want to stay in power. As Alex Clement of G0 reminds us, trust, as we keep hearing, is broken. Only 16% of Americans trust their government, down 60 points from peak trust in the mid-1960s. Fewer than a third of Americans trust each other. Meanwhile, half of Americans say the media deliberately misleads them, and fewer than a quarter say journalists have society's interest at heart. Trust is a big issue, society-wide, but especially with the elites that are epitomized at this point by WEF. And yet, in spite of all this, at this Rebuilding Trust meeting, the World Economic Forum in their 2024 Global Risk Assessment Report identified misinformation and disinformation as the #1 most severe global risk over the next 2 years. Above climate crises, above wars, above economic issues, everything. Misinformation and disinformation, still these terrible talking points.
Disinformation makes money, and that's one of the, we need to follow that money, and we need to work with in particularly the global advertising industry, that a lot of those dollars go to pretty bad content. And so you can work really hard on exclusion lists or inclusion lists, just to really try to focus ad dollars and challenge the global advertising industry all around the world to focus their ad dollars towards the good news and information, the accurate and relevant news and information.
And with this in mind, Reuters pointed out all the mistrust going on by so many different players, different countries, different parts of the world, different sectors of societies, and yet all of them have in common a pushback against technology. They wrote in part, the highest level of mistrust about the management of innovation was in the United States. The report said examples of pushback against technology included Beijing dropping out of mandates after online pushback, U.S. Republican positions against electric vehicles, and Hollywood's writers' battle against the use of artificial intelligence in writing scripts, because it's also just pathetic. Resistance to innovation is political, the survey said. Be that as it may, the underlying factor is a distrust in technology as the power of our society. Presumably, the WEF elites and their quest for domination don't want more pushback, so therefore it makes sense to rebuild trust. But even they know that's not going to easily happen. They invited people this year. Not only did the Heritage president, Kevin Roberts, go there, but he said some very pointed things.
One thing that Davos, you might say, and the people come here stand up for, is liberal democracy.
It's laughable that you would, or anyone would, describe Davos as protecting liberal democracy.
Kevin Roberts wrote in part, the infamous, hypocritical, self-avowed Marxists, private jet environmentalists, and genocide-adjacent humanitarians want to hear from the Heritage Foundation how they can rebuild trust with everyday Americans against whom they have weaponized their institutions, with an institution that everyday Americans perceive as hostile. Good luck rebuilding trust from that. In my view, this is part of the game. I don't think they're concerned about everyday Americans viewing them as hostile. When you really dig into it, their supposed agenda of trust really amounts to putting it back onto the users, onto dissenters, onto online speech, as though that is the problem. That's why they've centered on misinformation and disinformation as being the biggest risk in the very year that they look to rebuild trust. An unelected, unaccountable global elite who parade annually on stage at their global forum that appears to impose or at least cheerlead some collectivizing, controlling, centralizing, freedom-destroying, constitution-circumventing policies that benefit primarily an already powerful and extremely wealthy corporate elite and their most subservient political figureheads. They mostly don't care what we think. So how can they really be looking to rebuild trust on that level? They primarily just need enough trust and consensus to roll this new phase forward without obstacles before there's no turning back.
The good news is the elite across the world trust each other more and more, so we can come together and design and do beautiful things together. The bad news is that in every single country they were polling, the majority of people trusted that elite less. So we can lead, but if people aren't following, we're not going to get to where we want to go.
But on another level, Klaus Schwab's speech strongly suggests a different definition of trust altogether. Reading the words of Klaus Schwab, listening to the words that he spoke, comes off much more like that of a trust of a foundation, of an estate or an asset that's entrusted, given over for management. Or perhaps it speaks to yet another definition of trust, that of an organization formed explicitly for the purpose of regulating the supply and price of commodities, such as a sugar trust, etc. A combination, a secretive cum conspiratorial board profiting off of artificially manipulated economies. Is that what this is about? Our future, the direction of our shared earth, our rights and political systems upon it, being held as a property in trust is held. Is that what this is really about?
To break this cycle, we need a paradigm shift. We must rebuild trust, and that's actually the theme of our meeting. We have to rebuild trust. Trust in our future.
What does he mean? To whom and to what exactly is he referring?
Trust is not just a feeling. Trust is a commitment to action, to belief, to hope. To achieve this, we must rediscover and embrace the narrative that has driven humanity since its inception, acting as trustees for a better future.
Did you hear that?
Acting as trustees for a better future.
He says,
This narrative isn't about short-term gains or individual successes. It is about stewardship. To rebuild trust, there is a fundamental need to embody trusteeship, which means to care for the greater good. Let's use this annual meeting to rebuild trust by exercising our trusteeship individually and collectively. For safeguarding the future of humanity and nature. Thank you.
this interpretation of a trusteeship, a stewardship, a combination trust recalls very much the 1992 Unsaid Conference and the video about it done by George Hunt.
This is the logo of the Earth Summit. This is not a dove in their Earth Summit logo. It is a hand.
The United Nations Conference on Environmental Development, whose motto and logo was "In Our Hands."
In whose hands? Who is the we in this motto?
Literally showing the concept of in their hands, a global worldwide environmental trust, one that is managed by banking interest and other management interest, in the name of tackling, quote, truly global systemic problems that they have determined can only be, quote, solved through a big enough net, with a scale too big to control through mere democratic energies, right? Just as Schwab said this year in 2024.
The concept of trust and trusteeship compels us to think beyond borders and beyond our lifetimes.
That's a jurisdictional boundary outside of nation states and traditional rights, which is very troubling because they're not defined. There's very little restrictions in what they could do there with their trust. If you think it through, there's a real problem there for us little people, for the individuals, for our personal lives, and especially for our rights in the scheme of this whole thing that's become our lives with these people in the mix. That a word like trust is being used so pointedly yet deceptively with its own hidden agenda, just the usage of the word trust, and everyone, in a sense, trusting that rebuilding trust has just a surface level meaning is itself kind of upsetting, honestly.
We must rebuild trust, and that's actually the theme of our meeting. We have to rebuild trust. Trust, trust, trust. Trust, trust, acting as trustees. The concept of trust and trusteeship. As trustees of the future, trust as trustees.
$43 hot dog. Buy a ticket for 19 grand. You must be a member of the Economic Forum, which costs a mere $52,000. And remember, that's only if you're invited. So now you're around 71K. VIPs prefer a private chalet, and for that, 140 grand for the week. You want a wingman or woman, which WEF calls industry partner. With the add-on, we're now over $250,000. A chauffeur-driven Mercedes for the week, actually a bargain at 10 grand. The private jet. More than 1,000 of those flew into the environmentally focused conference this week. And if you don't own your own jet, $70,000 round trip.
One ubiquitous type of ID, and certainly that it was digital, and certainly that it was biometric.
Individual carbon footprint tracker, a globally coordinated system of carbon taxes.
In conclusion, trust, embody trusteeship to rebuild trust by exercising our trusteeship. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear Klaus.
Importantly, by identifying disinformation and misinformation as the single biggest planetary risk this year, the same year that they set, quote, rebuilding trust as their main agenda point, they're shifting the blame and putting the burden on the rest of us, not on the reasons that common people don't trust this unelected, unaccountable para-government that has the audacity to go on stage and say these things, but to the trust of, are these common people engaging in disinformation and misinformation? And how do we know who they are? And how do we know what they're doing? And how do we regulate what they're saying and doing? That's really what this gets into. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
Your annual global risk report makes for a stunning and sobering read. For the global business community, the top concern for the next 2 years is not conflict or climate. It is disinformation and misinformation.
Is full of rebels.
And of course, during the last few years, in the name of disinformation and misinformation, many of us online have seen our ability to be heard greatly diminished, if not restricted and banned altogether. Von der Leyen hit this language pretty hard in her speech.
For example, with disinformation and misinformation. And nowhere has there been more of that than on the issue of Ukraine.
But is it not they who smelt it that dealt it? She said in part,
rebuilding trust. This is not a time for conflicts or polarization. This is a time to build trust.
I mean, is this just all utter BS and word salad, or is this leading to something important? She said in part,
business have the innovation, the technology, the talents to deliver the solutions we need, to fight threats like climate change or industrial-scale disinformation.
The business solutions and the technology around the algorithms, stymie dissidents, and a brackish backwater pool of the internet. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just because those are things that we've actually experienced in the last couple of years, and I'm still kind of bitter about it.
Disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation and misinformation. Industrial-scale disinformation. For example, with disinformation and misinformation.
industrial scale disinformation, by which they don't actually mean industrial scale. They actually just mean individual common people with whom they want to rebuild trust, who they also want to suppress into non-existence. Sorry, nothing two-faced going on here at all. Von der Leyen says,
because our democracies and our businesses have interests that align, creating equal opportunity and freedom.
I mean, how this kind of utter nonsense can be uttered and yet trust be demanded. I don't know.
And there is no doubt that we face the greatest risk to the global order in the post-war era. But in order to face risks, we have to take risks.
So clearly, disinfo, misinfo, catch-all buzzwords, whatever problem children they might want to deal with, totally vague, borderline meaningless.
It has never been more important for the public and private sector to create new connective tissue.
The EU issued another report on disinformation. It was timed with the 2024 WEF conference, and it addresses the reduced trust in public institutions, the spread of false stories, harassment allegedly going on online, and the sowing of hatred against nations and groups of people. And by groups of people, they probably pretty much mean themselves.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear Klaus,
listen to the way that the European Commission Vice President Josep Borrell talks about us, the people, the little ones. As The Guardian writes in part, this new warfare, quote unquote, does not involve but words and ideas that colonize you. So you've got mouthpieces for one of the most elite organizations on the planet lecturing other people about words and ideas that, quote, colonize you. That's the new warfare. It's everyone else. It's not the things going on there. Without irony, this report states the goal is not only to shape the global narratives, but also to suppress and silence dissenting voices. They're supposedly not talking about themselves. It's those that are doing the disinfo, not those that are censoring the dissenting voices. Yeah. Are you keeping track of that? And Borrell also apparently said, keep in mind that unchecked malicious content spreads like a and puts the health of the democracy at risk. But we have the tools to fight against this. So they have the tools to check the spread of malicious content. The viewpoints of dissenters online, that's not the democracy. It's the elite people with the tools to suppress the speech. They're the ones protecting the democracy, and the democracy exists in some bubble somewhere. I don't know.
Because the boundary between online and offline is getting thinner and thinner.
When you really think about what's being said here, what we're talking about is an overwide net that has been cast over the smaller voices and is discriminating against many individuals in the name of so-called democracy.
The next years will require us to think in the same way.
Is WEF really talking about, even theoretically, restoring trust, quote unquote, of their brand with the people?
If you go back really not that long ago, as I say, we owned the news. We were the gatekeepers, and we very much owned the facts as well. If it said it in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, then that was a fact. Nowadays, people can go to all sorts of different sources for the news, and they're much more questioning about what we're saying.
Or is it, as I've suggested, a lot more like blame shifting to use disinfo to distrust dissenting voices among the common people and put the burden on them and the supposedly horrible things they say, and not on the system that's done so much harm to so many people, has usurped so many rights, and really set out a forward-thinking, organized agenda to destroy freedom of speech, and to undermine dissent on the internet.
The next years will require us to think in the same way. Thank you very much.